Okay. So earlier we were discussing some of your influences. Is there an author or a poet or authors or poets that you could say maybe directly influenced the way you write and the structure of your work?
Um, well, you mentioned Bukowski, and we talked about
Mm-hmm.
bringing him into the poetry class and all that. Um, he was, like I said this before, he was the first writer who made me think that maybe I could write. And the first thing you look at this and wow, this seems like something I can do. It's not that hard. And then you try to do it, and it's really really hard. You figure that out very quickly. And so he was probably the first one who made me want to think I could, or made me think I could write. And so I suppose that's an influence. But I think I gravitated towards that because I write kind of would have written kind of like that anyways. Um, and so that was an influence. And then from reading Bukowski, it led me to John Fonte, who I discovered, figured out later that this is Bukowski's main influence. And once I figured that out, I kind of lost interest in most of the Bukowski stuff because it was so, it seemed secondary because somebody else had already done it earlier and I think better, at least as far as novels go. And so that became very important to me. This idea of the, for those anybody who's read Fonte, um, clean, simple lines that are very, very colorful though also and lean and fun and they move fast. And they say a lot, and so that was a really, really big deal. And I moved on as far as technically putting words on the paper. That would be where my lineage comes out of, and he comes out of Newt Hampson, or at least partially Norwegian writer, who wrote in a at least somewhat similar manner. You can see the influences there. So as far as laying down lines is in prose, anyways, that would be it. And then there's all sorts of other writers who influenced me as far as attitude and things like that. And in some ways, writing somebody like D.H. Lawrence, um, Henry Miller, um, people like that. But by that point, I had already figured out, I'd already kind of established how I write, so it could never influence me beyond kind of the edges. And so that's where it comes down to as far as prose goes. Um, what I'm trying to do now is those writers were the way they write was great, but I got really bored with their very personal subject matter, and that's the whole idea of moving beyond that with
Okay.
that style.
And certainly it's an interesting sort of path because you discovered um, John Fonte, and I'm guessing, um, right, Ask the Dusk, was that his first novel, if I'm
Second novel.
second novel, but that's the one that influenced Bukowski, is that correct?
Um,
Or did
yeah, that
his,
was the main one, but
yeah,
yeah, he from I understood he read the first one called Wait Until Spring Bandini as well,
okay,
both in the L.A. Public Library. They were both there,
right,
and he read
okay.
those.
And then you later ended up working with Dan Fonte,
Mm-hmm.
um, John Fonte's son,
Mm-hmm.
on the novel, and so that's kind of an. Can you speak to that connection or relationship?
Um, it was well before I right before I was writing Heaping Stones. I just happened to I'd never read any of Dan's work before. I knew the name. I knew he was John Fonte's son. I'd never heard the name. For whatever reason, I'd never read his work. And for whatever reason, I read his first two U.S. published novels, um, Chump Change and Mooch, and um, and they kind of reminded me of that way of writing, and that I like that way of writing, and that my voice was going to come out of that technical way of putting words on a paper. And I just got really interested in that. And it just so happened that at Long Beach State, Cal State Long Beach, there was a seminar on John Fonte being taught by Stephen Cooper, who was the biographer of John Fonte. Um, and I was not in school, and I was not in English. I was already long out of school or anything, but I just took this class through extensions just for the fun of it. Um, and I kind of butted heads with Cooper the whole semester long. Um, and I just happened to mention that I liked Dan's writing, and he gave me Dan's email, and I just sent him an email saying, I read your books, I like your stuff, blah blah blah. Here's who I am, and he And I told him about the book I was working on, which was Heaping Stones at that time. And he asked me, he said, hey, if you want to drive up to Santa Monica, which is where he was living at the time, you know, drop off your manuscript, we'll take a look at it and give you advice or whatever. And I went there, and he did. And I got 2 parking tickets the same day that I went up there because,
bastards.
Well, I was running late, and if I didn't get the car parked, I was not. He was going to walk out on me. I'd look like a total idiot, and et cetera, et cetera. So I just parked in some random place, and I guess I broke 2 laws somehow while I parked there. And so my trip cost me like $80 to get up there. And that's how that came about. And he just turned out to be very open to helping me and all that kind of stuff. Gave me some very good advice. He turned the book from being 325 pages into 140 pages and overnight. And that's how that worked.
Very cool. And you ended up publishing one of his plays, right? Don Giovanni.
Yeah, editing and publishing one of his plays. Yeah, which was about his dad, actually. The last days of his life.
Very cool. So, with that connection to your, as you put it, more personal kind of writing, such as Heaping Stones, what was your influence towards the kind of more, I don't know, expansive writing of the Backwaters Legendarium? Did you have specific models, or if not specific, just sort of general inspirational authors that led you towards that
yeah,
angle?
Well, I mean, some of the people I've already talked about. Somebody like D.H. Lawrence was a big influence. A lot of people talk about D.H. Lawrence because of his, as being one of these breakthrough authors who writes about things like sex and things like that, which is very important. But if you read his books, especially something like, say, like Women in Love, it's really an exploration of landscape as well, and culture in societies. And so, and yet he still has a very obsessive kind of narrow writing style in certain ways, and it showed me how I could adapt certain things I was doing to something bigger, a bigger palette. Somebody like Gary Snyder, even though I don't write anything like he writes, even remotely like he writes, he has a very different way of putting words on paper. He showed me how to come from a very, because he, for example, in his essays, he writes from a very personal standpoint, and he brings into a much bigger world beyond himself, talking about his life and his region in Sierra Nevadas, and how it connects with history and place, etc. And so that was an influence in a broad sense, not a specific sense, because again, I don't write anything like he writes. And he's another person I emailed, actually. He was quite nice, and I sent him a poem, and he said he liked it, which was pretty cool.
Totally.
And a poem called Orange Crush, which is actually dedicated to him from Edgewater, and he liked it. Actually, he said, good poem, great title. I prefer it was the other way around, but I will take that.
Take it either way.
I will take it. And then I sent him a copy of Heaping Stones and heard nothing, so I don't think he liked that very much, even though the title actually comes from one of his poems.
Okay.
Another really big influence as far as expanding the palette would be Lawrence Durrell, who we actually already talked about. He's the only writer I've ever read who I wish I could write like that. I read his stuff and I go, shit. I really wish I could do what he does, but I can't. And just he approaches the writing almost like painting, where space and texture and color and all this stuff are as much a part of the story as the action. And I found that really, really inspiring. I still do. He's one of my favorite writers. He's not very hip at the moment. He goes in and out of fashion. Right now he's not in fashion, which is reason to like him more, I think. Yeah. And so that was huge. Lots of things. I mean, just lots and lots of different things. Like reading things like Dumas and forgetting the big romantic thing. Reading or somebody even like Raymond Chandler, reading something like that, showing how you can create a universe with this very narrow idea. In other words, expand from the narrow to the broad,
Right.
which, because the backwater books are written in the first person, and so you automatically have to do that by definition. And so that was that kind of stuff. So all over the place as far as that kind of things go. But poetry is a totally different world, but as far as the prose goes, it's those kind of writers, you know.
Would it be fair to say, though, that I can't think of really a precedent for bringing the sort of influences of, you know, Snyder and, you know, Chandler and that sort of thing. More specifically, I am thinking of Snyder and sort of the kind of ecological sensibility into the realm of science fiction. I mean, is there a model for that? I mean, maybe there is somewhere, but are you aware of anyone that's done that sort of thing?
Well, if you want to classify these books as science fiction, I'd say they more have a science fiction element
Right.
to them in science fiction. I don't, I'm probably the wrong person to ask because I've read a fair amount of science fiction, but I'm not an expert, and who knows what's out there that I've missed.
Right.
I'd like to think I'm fairly attuned.
But
to
as far as you know, yeah.
No. I mean, there's some things here and there. But you got to understand where science fiction comes from. It comes out of technology for the most part. I mean, it really doesn't exist until the late 1800s.
Right.
I mean, there's things earlier in history you could point to, going back further in time. But it's really not until you start thinking of people like Mary Shelley and things like that, Frankenstein, that you start getting what you might want to call science fiction. And it's so much of it, especially what we think of as modern science fiction, it comes out of the Cold War and the technologies of space exploration and things like that,
Right.
which are in a sense the idea of subduing nature still. So in other words, most science fiction would be the exact opposite of what somebody like a Gary Snyder would do.
Right.
But I think that's just organic in that all of these ideas of conquering nature are showing to be completely false and untenable. And so the idea would be that if you're going to do any kind of science fiction in the classical sense, it's going to have an ecological component because there's nothing else left. There is stuff that gets sometimes classified as science fiction that's mostly about computers and things like that. Sometimes it's called cyberpunk, things like that. Right. I think that is just kind of the last fumes of something. I don't think it has any future. And so I'm kind of the opposite of that. And I don't know if maybe that's something I've done worthwhile, is that there is no precedent for that. It might just be fluky that my interests happened to go over these two regions, but
that could be. And one author that I haven't heard you mention thus far, but I noticed some kind of connection to is Ray Bradbury. There's kind of a luminous quality, for lack of a better term, to his writing that I also find in yours. It's sort of an otherworldly sense that I get that really does transcend the genre, and I don't know if he has been a direct influence or maybe more of a, again, lack of a better term, a sort of spiritual kind of influence, like maybe somebody that you have read and enjoyed but don't necessarily say, this aspect of his work I feel and I'm gonna specifically bring into my world.
The problem with that would be I read him far too young to really talk about that. Because long before I ever thought about writing, I think I read him in 5th grade, 6th grade,
And we had a class together, the science fiction class, where we read Martian Chronicles, but you may have read that before.
I read that earlier than
Okay.
that, and I read short stories earlier than that. I've always liked the way he writes. I mean, he's essentially a very high-end pulp writer, which is not necessarily a derogatory thing. He wrote for sales. He wrote to create a big audience and bring ideas to a big audience, and etc. And he did a very good job of it. And I do like the way he writes, and I like the directness of it. And those books were all Martian Chronicles, and I think we both share Dandelion Wine as one of our favorite novels of all time. And I think that's an absolutely wonderful novel. But any influence he had would be so buried in my past that I could not tell you what it was.
Right.
You know, I mean, it's just in there with the big mix, and who knows if you could psychoanalyze me or hypnotize me, something might come out. But
Yeah.
I couldn't tell you. Although he's a favorite, he always will. I actually reviewed one of his last books for the Guardian
Oh, okay.
in England, and he's another author I met briefly.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he used to routinely do readings at a bookstore in Long Beach called Acres of Books, which no longer exists.
Yeah.
And actually I wasn't even planning on going there. I had no idea he was in town. I was just going there to wander the stacks and look at books. And I walked in the door. It's like, oh crap, that's Ray Bradbury. And I shook his hand or whatever, briefly talked to him. That was it. You know, he was pretty old at that point.
Yeah.
He's what, early 80s or something. So, but yeah, I mean, whatever. He's probably there. I'm sure he is somewhere.
Very cool.
I mean, a lot of that stuff from schools. I mean, I'm sure Tolkien's in there. And
right.
All that stuff, but I couldn't begin to tell you how.
Yeah, and you know, one might argue, you know, maybe there's no point in completely dissecting influences, but on one hand, it's interesting, and it helps to make a sort of connection to the continuum of writing, and certainly when you are taking, you know, what may or may not be science fiction into a sort of different realm, it's just an interesting thing to question. But as the author yourself, it's on the other hand not really an issue because it's all coming from within you, and you know, anyway. So
yeah, I mean, like I said, I have no idea what influence somebody like Ray Bradbury had on me because it's too long ago.
Right.
You know, it's before I think when you start talking about influence, it's almost like there has to be some conscious recognition that you want to write.
Right.
Or you can't say or it becomes just too diffused to talk about.
Yeah.
So I can talk about John Fonte because I read and go, I do something just like this, or this is going to help me understand why I write the way I write, etc.,
right.
etc. Well, I can't say that about somebody like Bradbury.
Yeah, good point. Well, I will have to say that, you know, for those that may be leery of, you know, quote unquote, modern literature, and thinking that it's all such tightly wound symbolism and allegory, while that may be present in your work, it reads great. I mean, you know, I think everybody that I've spoken to that has read your work, to a person has said, you know, shit, I read this, I sat down and started to read it, and then I couldn't, all of a sudden I was done reading it, you know, and however many hours had passed. And I think there's a certain quality to it that lends itself to that takes nothing away from the depth of its vision or the depth of its purpose. And I think that's a quality in authors that people may not expect to find in something that's not, you know, a modern pulp novel that you'd, you know, find at the check stand at the grocery store.
I don't know. I don't see any reason why something has to be boring to be good.
Right.
I think maybe the exact opposite is the truth. I don't know. You have to kind of pull it outside of books to do this, but I remember years ago I heard reading an interview or hearing, I don't remember where I heard it from, with Lou Reed about his singing and his writing songs. About his writing songs, he said, he's first starting out in the Velvet Underground. He's saying, why can't I talk about serious subjects and still have the same fun as rock and roll? Why can't I have 3 chords, yeah, 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 and still talk about big things? And why not? You know, why do you have to? Why does the fun have to go away at that point? And that really got me thinking. he's right. You know, why can't you do that? You don't need a lot of complicated things to say your point. You know, you can have a lot more fun other ways. And another thing he said about his singing, his very limited singing, was that his style was he wanted to be like he was sitting next to somebody on a couch telling him a story. And that's kind of how I want to write. I want people to sit down like I'm telling. That's part of the reasons I think I write in first person so much.
Mm-hmm.
Is it's like somebody's telling you a story, and there shouldn't be any distance between the writer and the reader, or as little as possible.
Right.
Anyways. And I think a lot of people forget that. A lot of writers today forget that. They forget that they don't write for themselves, they write for readers. I mean, essentially we all write for ourselves on some level, because if it doesn't satisfy us, we don't do it. But there's an audience out there, you know, that's who you're writing for. And it's not so much that you compromise what you say to please an audience, but you really think about what you're saying and how you say it, and how can I say it so that everybody can get involved, as opposed to making a little club
Right.
for everybody, you know, for people in the know, which I can't stand. And so if there's a readability, it's because of respecting the audience and trying to make it, again, open it up for everybody. There's no idea in any of my books that any reasonably intelligent person who wants to deal with can't understand. You know? I don't think there's any idea worth having that falls outside of that category. Maybe a few things in physics.
Right.